As we've seen, the first line of defense is important for keeping pathogens out of the body. But if pathogens get in, we need to have a mechanism to deal with it. That's where our second and third lines of defense come in. The second and third lines of defense work together to fight pathogens once they're in the body. The second line of defense is made up of a number of non-specific mechanisms. These don't depend on recognizing the particular pathogen that's in the body. It can attack lots of different pathogens. And there are many different second line of defense mechanisms that we're going to discuss. At the same time as these non-specific mechanisms are at work, the specific mechanisms of the third line of defense are gearing up to particularly attack the specific pathogen that's gotten into the body. Let's take a look at these second lines of defense more carefully. Again, these are non-specific mechanisms that attack pathogens once they're in the body. One of the most important second line of defense mechanisms is inflammation. Inflammation is a rather complex, multifaceted response to any kind of tissue damage. When you damage your body's tissues in any way, whether it's an infection or a physical injury, then inflammation is the body's response. Inflammation has several important functions when it comes to helping the body after some type of tissue damage. First, inflammation helps to kill any pathogens that may have gotten into a damaged area, or at least limit the spread of the pathogen. Two, the events of inflammation help to remove debris, dead cells, and damaged tissue. Three, inflammation initiates tissue repair to heal the damage. As I mentioned, inflammation is a complicated process. I'm going to try to simplify it to just the main steps of what's going on during the process of inflammation. Inflammation starts with some sort of tissue damage. That tissue damage results in the release of inflammatory chemicals. Inflammatory chemicals are released by the damaged blood vessels, they're released by mast cells found in the tissues, and they're released by basophils in addition to other cells. There are a lot of inflammatory chemicals, and I just want to hit a few of the highlights. One important inflammatory chemical released as a result of tissue damage is heparin. Heparin is released by basophils and mast cells, and heparin, which we've seen before, helps prevent blood clotting. This is important to make sure we maintain a blood supply to the damaged area, because without a blood supply, it's going to be very hard to fix the problem. In addition to heparin, we also have histamine being released by those basophils and mast cells. Histamine causes vasodilation, so the blood vessels get a little bit larger in diameter to increase the blood flow to that area. And histamine also increases the capillary permeability. What that means is it makes it easier for molecules and fluids to get in and out of the capillaries. This increases blood flow to the area and increases the availability of nutrients and signaling molecules that are important for inflammation. A third group of inflammatory chemicals are the leukotrienes. Leukotrienes cause vasodilation and they increase capillary permeability, much like we saw with histamine. But they also have another function, and that is that they attract leukocytes. They attract neutrophils, macrophages, and other white blood cells to the site of damage. And this is important to fight pathogens as well as to help with the cleanup and healing. Two other groups of inflammatory chemicals are the kinins and the prostaglandins. Now these come from different areas, but they have the same function, which is why I tend to lump them together. Kinins and prostaglandins increase vasodilation and capillary permeability. They attract leukocytes, but they also induce pain. They bind to pain receptors and actually cause the sensation of pain. Now this is something that typically we don't like, but the sensation of pain is very important to tell the body that there is damage, and that allows us to take steps to minimize what has occurred and to heal the damage. So tissue damage occurs and inflammatory chemicals are released. If we think about the functions of most of those inflammatory chemicals, nearly all of them we mentioned are going to increase vasodilation and increase capillary permeability. This brings more fluid, more nutrients, more signaling molecules, and more cells to the damaged tissue. The sorts of cells that are coming along in response to these inflammatory chemicals include leukocytes. especially neutrophils and macrophages. These neutrophils and macrophages begin by rolling along the inside of blood vessels, and when they get to an area of damage, they recognize the signals from the inflammatory chemicals and they stop. This is a process called margination, where the white blood cells stop on the inside of the blood vessels in areas of damaged tissue. Next, they change their shape so they can squeeze out of the capillaries in a process called emigration or diapedesis, both pretty cool terms that mean the white blood cells squeeze out of the capillaries. And once they're out of the capillaries and the tissues, they're attracted to the damage by a process called chemotaxis. They're attracted to those inflammatory chemicals and move in the direction of the damage. Once the white blood cells have left the blood vessel and gotten out into the damaged tissue, they can begin helping the situation. Neutrophils are going to be the first to respond. Remember, those are the ones that respond first to any sort of infection or damage. And the neutrophils begin phagocytizing bacteria and any other nasty things they might find there. Now, the neutrophils die pretty quickly, and that leaves behind dead cell parts. The macrophages come next, and the macrophages are the body's cleanup crew. They're going to phagocytize bacteria, viruses, debris, dead tissue, fungi, the dead neutrophils. Macrophages are going to help clean all of that up. Other leukocytes, including those involved in the third line of defense, are specific lymphocytes that can fight off the particular pathogen, are also called into play here. So we have lots of white blood cells that end up in the damaged tissue fighting off the pathogens. Once the pathogen is gone and the damage has been cleaned up, we can turn to the process of healing. And growth factors released from the blood vessels and the platelets can stimulate cell division to make new cells to replace those that were damaged, and also fibrosis for tissue repair. There are many classic signs of inflammation. Think for just a moment about what it looks like if you have an inflamed body part. What are the signals or the symptoms of that inflammation? The 5 classic signs of inflammation are redness, heat, swelling, pain, and loss of function. And all 5 of these can be explained by thinking about the inflammatory chemicals that were released and what they're doing during the process of inflammation.